I want to speak with you today about blindness and sight, light and darkness, life and death. So nothing too serious. One of my single mates shared with me how he got his relatives off his back when they were hassling him about marriage. So you see, every wedding he went to, one of his great aunts would lean over and say, "You'll be next." And he got so fed up with this that at the next funeral, he leant over to his great aunt and said, "You'll be next." Life and death. I wonder if anyone ever told you that life revolved around them. Or maybe maybe they didn't say it, but perhaps they kind of acted like it, that the life revolves around them. Now, I know that none of you would actually act like that, right? Though some actually act like it and never actually say it. What about what Jesus says? He says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." That's quite an extraordinary thing to say. He's saying, I am the only person in the world who understands what life is about. That's what he's saying. And if you follow me, you'll know it too. But if you don't follow me, you'll never know what life is all about. It's a pretty confronting kind of statement that Jesus says in John 8, isn't it? It's a pretty confronting thing for someone to say. You'd want to have pretty good evidence to say something like that, wouldn't you? Now, in this passage, we see some evidence for that statement, and we get to see three different approaches to the evidence that's presented about the identity of Jesus. So I'm going to go through those three perspectives on evidence that we see in this passage in John 9. So firstly, we see the leaders of the day, the opinion leaders, the Pharisees. The way you might react to someone saying, "I'm the centre of life," is probably similar to the way that the leaders reacted to Jesus at the time. See, the temple leaders were on the warpath. They'd tried to stone Jesus. They'd planned to kill Jesus. They were kicking anyone out of Jerusalem who'd become Jesus' disciples. They were taking this pretty seriously. And so you can imagine for the leaders, you can imagine their annoyance, their irritation when they hear reports that this man who talks himself up as the light of the world has actually healed someone's sight. And these highly educated leaders they just know it couldn't possibly happen. Pick it up with me in John 9, verse 13. In John chapter 9, verse 13. Feel free to pause this, go and grab your Bible and bring it back. John 9:13. They brought it to the Pharisees. They brought to the Pharisees, they're the opinion leaders, they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Verse 14, now the day on which Jesus had made mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied. "I washed and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." The problem, according to the leaders, is that the man who reckons that he's the light of the world is working on the Sabbath. No one, according to them, could possibly respect and honour God who does anything on the Sabbath, which is the 1 day in 7 quarantine for worship and rest. The taking the Sabbath is one of the 10 Commandments. And because the law doesn't specify what exactly can be done or can't be done, these leaders have filled in the details. And this guy who reckons he's the light of the world doesn't love God enough to follow their detailed interpretation of the law. And so it's almost as if he's proved himself to be a fraud by his behaviour. To them, he's a sinner. The leaders think, God's not going to work through this guy if he's a fraud and a sinner. But the leader's position doesn't satisfy everyone. There's chatter around and they say in verse 17, how can a sinner perform such signs? Even the blind man who was healed himself said that this man is a prophet. So though they don't believe it, you can see in verse 18, and they don't believe it, though they don't believe it, they investigate the situation. And so as they investigate the situation, they're willing to publicly interview the alleged blind man's parents to see if the alleged blind man was indeed blind. Now, what do you do when evidence goes against what you believe? The rational thing, the logical thing, when the evidence says that you are wrong, is to change. But when you're in the heat of an argument, do you often do what is logical and rational, right? I suspect you do what these guys do. When they don't like the evidence, they just start shouting louder. They call Jesus more names. They hurled insults even at the blind man who was healed in verse 28. They say not only that Jesus is a sinner, but the healed man was steeped in sin from birth. See, the volume rises and the anger rises and the animosity rises in the face of this evidence. That's the first response to the evidence that I wanted to show you in this passage. That this unwillingness to believe where the evidence points. Now, as you take a step back, I totally get their response. They doubted the evidence at first, and then when confronted with compelling evidence, if they were to do the logical, the principled thing, they would have had to do an about face. They would have had to recognise that they'd been wrong. And nobody finds that easy. As we go through a refresh course, which I'll invite you to it later, you get to walk through and be an eyewitness to the account of Jesus' life. As you interact with the ancient historians who speak the truth of these accounts, the evidence is quite compelling. And so I'd love you to come along to a refresh course. But I want to say to you, please, don't do what these men do. Don't have an unwillingness to recognise the evidence of who Jesus is. Rather, follow the evidence to its conclusion. Please do mark on one of the Connect cards if you want to join one of these courses. So that's the first response to the evidence of the blind man's healing, a refusal to believe where the evidence points. Now, the second response is from the blind man's parents. Now, I mentioned before that the parents were called before the leaders to testify to whether their son was blind or whether this was all just a hoax. Listen to what they say. Verse 19. This is what the leaders say. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind, but how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself." So yes, the parents recognise the evidence. Unlike the leaders, the parents recognise the evidence. They say, we know there's been a change. Something miraculous has happened to their son. They see the evidence, but they're unwilling to follow the evidence to its conclusion. And we're told why. Verse 22, his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who already had decided that anyone acknowledging that Jesus was a Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why, verse 23, his parents said, "He's of age, ask him." Now, it sounds a bit like the parents are throwing their son under the bus here or under the chariot, perhaps. Like, in order to get to stay in the synagogue, they've thrown him under the bus. But in their defence, this is bigger than it sounds. Being removed from the synagogue is like losing your driver's license, losing your job, losing your passport in one fell swoop. You risk losing access to the centre of your community. You're losing your connection to finding a job. You're losing your identity. There's a lot to be lost here. So I've got some sympathy with their attitude towards the evidence, these parents. They recognise the evidence, but they're unwilling to commit to its conclusions. But on the other hand, that is a picture of what the Bible calls sin. Now, we think of sin as committing murder, and that is sin, but beneath that is an attitude towards God. Sin is an unwillingness to recognise God for who he is as the creator and authority over life. See, here the parents are unwilling to recognise the work of God in Jesus for fear of what they might lose. That is a rejection of God. See, these parents saw what the Son of God did, and they rejected the opportunity to recognise him. They came into the floodlight that is the light of the world, and they retreated back into the shadows because they wanted to hold on to the value of the stuff of this life rather than to recognise God in Jesus. Friends, that is a dangerous place to be. To have seen and to have known the evidence of the Son of God, the light of the world, but to not walk in his light, to remain in darkness, in the blindness of sin. That is a dangerous place to be. And that's where the parents are. So we've seen a couple of responses to the evidence so far. We've seen the leaders, they refuse to acknowledge the evidence of Jesus. And we've seen the parents who acknowledge the evidence but refuse the conclusion that the evidence points to. And now we come to my favourite character favourite minor character in the Gospel of John, the blind man who is healed. If you were here last week, you would have met him. Last week we met him early on in chapter 9. He was in the queue of the smelly, dirty humanity that was the line of beggars. And he was the very definition of an outsider with no hope and with no future. Yet Jesus walks past him and gave him the instructions necessary to bring about sight. Jesus healed him, and now he sees. And because all of this has happened to him, he gets called before the leaders who don't believe him. And he gets to see his parents distancing themselves from his testimony. Now, we've seen that his suspicion is that Jesus is a prophet. Remember, he's already been through this with his neighbours. He keeps on saying to people, yeah, I'm the blind beggar, I'm that guy, I'm the man. It's like when you have a cast on your arm, right? Every time you meet someone new, you've got to retell the story of how you tripped up the stairs or whatever happened. And here he goes again, telling the same old story, verse 24. A second time, they summoned the man who had been born blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. Verse 25, he replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. You know, I love this about him. He recognises what he does know and what he doesn't know. He's not prepared to declare Jesus as a sinner. He doesn't know that. And the evidence that he is willing to draw, the conclusion he's willing to draw based on the evidence is this: I was blind, but now I see. I love this about him too. He goes on to give the leaders some cheek. He says to them, oh, you're asking these questions because you want to be a disciple of Jesus, do you? And of course, they blew up. They got angry with him. And yet you see in all of this that he's not intimidated by their anger. He comes back to what he knows. He comes back to the evidence, something the leaders refuse to do. And this is what this formerly blind man says. Verse 30, have a look there. Verse 30, this is what he says. Now, that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of the opening of the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. In this court case, with the leaders, this man The formerly blind man is the only one looking at the evidence. This must be from God, he says. God wouldn't pull off these miracles through this man if he was a God hater, as you say he is. He's testifying to Jesus at great personal cost. The very thing his parents were afraid of, this man received. He was thrown out of the temple, which, like as I said before, was a bit like losing a passport, losing a job, losing a driver's license, all in one fell swoop. See, this man testifies to Jesus at great personal cost. See, this man is testifying to Jesus, but here's the surprising thing. He's testifying to Jesus before he even knows that Jesus is God's son. We'll see that in a moment. But I chat with lots of Christians who say, I can't tell people about Jesus. I can't make Christ known. I don't know enough to do that. When you say that, when you think that, I want you to remember this passage and remember that you know more about Jesus than this guy did. And from what he knew of Jesus, he was willing to lose his passport, his job, his driver's license, just to speak about Jesus. See, you know more about Jesus than that. You know that Jesus is going to die for his sin. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know that Jesus is going to be raised to new life. He doesn't even know that Jesus is God's son. You can see that in verse 35. Jesus heard that they'd thrown him out, and when he found him, you've got to love that about Jesus, right? Jesus said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, Lord?" the man asked. "Tell me so I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. He prostrated himself before Jesus. It's a remarkable few days, isn't it? This blind man has gone from physical blindness to physical sight. And he's gone from spiritual blindness, being an outsider to God, to spiritual sight. He's come to the light of the world, who says, "Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." This formerly blind man will never again walk in darkness, but he'll live with the light of life. Unlike the leaders, unlike even his parents, he sees the evidence and follows it to its conclusion. The leaders, they won't accept the evidence. The parents, they won't accept the conclusion. But this man, he sees the evidence and follows the conclusion. In fact, Jesus explains that is precisely what's going on here. Have a look at verse 39. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." And that is what is before us. The blind coming to see. It's almost as if the leaders knew he was talking about them. Verse 40, some Pharisees, the opinion leaders, remember, who were with him, heard him say this and said, "What? Are we blind too?" See, that is the right question. But there's no indication that they have an appetite for the answer. Before we sung these words, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Jesus declares that we are all lost, that without him we are all blind. Jesus declares that he is the light, that he knows life and can give it. I've got to ask you now, will you receive the life that he offers? I'm going to pray now, and I want to invite you to pray with me in the quietness of your heart. Let me first tell you the prayer I'm going to pray before I pray it. This is what I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray, Dear God, thank you for showing me the evidence of your work in the life of Jesus. Sorry that I so often put what I want before what you want. Please help me to respond in dependence like this blind man we've seen today. Please help me to learn more about Jesus. And please give me the courage to speak about Jesus. That's what I'm going to pray now. Why don't you pray with me? And dear God, thank you for showing me the evidence of your work in the life of Jesus. Sorry that I so often put what I want before what you want. Please help me to respond in dependence like this blind man we've seen today. Please help me to learn more about Jesus and give me the courage to speak about Jesus. Amen. Well, we're going to reflect on this next song together, which this formerly blind man could have sung. The song goes like this: Give us your strength, O God, and courage to speak. Perform your wondrous deeds through those who are weak. Let's sing this together.